Hello, my name is Katie.
My name is Cameron.
And this is Fashion Unfolded.
Oh, well, so good to be here. I love this.
It's been a minute. Quick catch up. Grad school has been grad school. We are approaching the final submission of our theses.
Yeah.
We have less than a month.
Oh. I'm a little bit further behind than most people, I want to say. You know, my timeline's, I think, different, given that my event is tied to a specific date and time.
Yeah.
So I'm a little bit behind, especially compared to you.
I'm an anomaly.
Yeah.
Me and David.
Yeah.
Yeah. But our theses are about fashion, and that is how I will segue us into the topic of today. In our second episode of the season, we talked a little bit about wanting to have some kind of grounding principle, which helps to be a through line through the season, because we are going to jump around in topics quite a bit. So we wanted to talk about what fashion studies is and like the project of defining the word fashion.
Yeah. And I mean, you've put together a great definition. I feel like the program has really prepared us for this. And when you Google fashion studies, the first thing that comes up really is this Parsons program here.
Yeah.
So, we are well prepared for this. And I will let you give your definition because, unsurprisingly, it's wonderful in theory. And I feel like it really sums it up well.
Well, when I talk about fashion studies, what I usually say in my own content as a YouTuber is that I study the sociocultural phenomenon of fashion, which in my opinion implies that it's necessarily interdisciplinary and reaches into everything which fashion touches. So it differs, I think, from fashion history, because fashion history is usually really focused either on object analysis or at looking at the ways in which fashion conceptually is produced and what fashion trends mean. But when you look at fashion studies and that interdisciplinary approach, it also means looking at things anthropologically, sociologically, economically, production and manufacture, distribution, like the fashion system itself.
Yeah.
So that's one of the things I think makes this program hard to define.
Yeah.
Is that it touches on so many different things.
Yeah. And I think that is the joy for me for this program, is that it allows me to bring in all of the different elements of my past lives that I've had here, working in political science or working in politics, studying political science, and bringing in any kind of approach that I have to it. Because there's so many different things that you can look at it. And I think even looking at all of the folks in our program who take such different approaches, like you as an anthropologist, there was a face made there. My doing political science, we folks doing art history, psychology, sociology, there's just so much that people bring into this program. And there's a richness that I think allows us to see a whole picture through this program and through fashion studies in general. And my definition is, we've talked about interdisciplinary there. I wrote an interdisciplinary framework that allows us to thoughtfully interrogate the fashion system and everything that interacts with it. So, our definitions weren't that much different.
Right.
We got together in the end there. But yeah, just thinking about the fashion system and the ways that we interact with it, I think it was just really interesting to me, because I didn't know that fashion studies existed as a discipline until I came to this program, until I started actually accidentally doing fashion studies work.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, I was putting together a project called American Distress, where I was exploring the Trump years through pieces that I found at secondhand stores across the country, right after the election and during that cycle. And somebody was like, this is a fashion studies project. And somebody at Parsons who brought me in to do some of their research, brought me in to talk about research methods in particular.
Gotcha.
And so I was talking to undergrad students about what research methods can look like. And that really inspired me to get into the rest of this, because I was like, oh, wow, I have very thoroughly researched this, right? Everything there's the citations of whatever shady comments I'd make about the NYPD, because there's one of those pieces in there. And everything was backed in data, but through the lens of how I saw the world. So for me, it was fashion. And they were like, this is fashion studies. Now that you know this, look at this program.
You said how you see the world. That is something I was literally just talking about this with my husband recently, and that one of the reasons why I feel so strongly, I I worry that I don't have very many convictions in life, but one of my convictions is education because it offers like me the opportunity to get other people to see the world through my lens, which I now realize like being in this program is through fashion. But like fashion is so uniquely positioned to do that because it touches everything in this world.
Yeah.
But I also think we should talk a little bit about like what do we mean by the word itself, fashion. So I think coming from, this is definitely influenced by my background in anthropology and archaeology. There's something in archaeology called lumping and splitting, which is basically the idea that like if you have a mountain and on one side of the mountain you have a pot shard that's painted blue and one on the other side of the mountain that's painted red, that those come from two like culturally distinct people. So that's a splitter. I might have said lumper. That's a splitter. A lumper, on the other hand, says these are both pot shards made from the same materials, made with similar methods. They're probably from the same culture. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So because everyone engages in fashion, regardless of like what term they use for that, I go for a rather broad definition of it that's pulled from a book called Fashion History: A Global Perspective, which says that fashion is an accepted style of dress at a given time and place. However, there are some problems with that broad of a definition, because if we allow that, then there's, the problem is that like you could, for example, say that Halloween costumes are a type of fashion, which can make it a little difficult to make distinctions between like fashion style dress, as Susan Kaiser would put it, who's a fashion scholar, who coincidentally teaches at the university from my hometown.
Oh, I had no idea.
Yeah, wild, right?
Shouts out to Susan Kaiser.
Full circle moment. But so that's how I tend to approach understanding fashion. And it's more of a framework for the researcher to take things from a broad perspective and then like allow whatever case study you're looking at to tell you what fashion is to them.
Yeah. And I love, as much as the time and space part complicates the narrative within that, it is probably my favorite part of like understanding fashion, because like it can be so cyclical, and what is in style at one moment, it is not at other moments. And I love that nature of it. And I think I think a lot, and I think because I've just spent so much time around like streetwear and like hype fashion and like sneaker culture, all of that, I think about how trends happen and what makes things popular and like the trend cycle in general. And really like the cultural language of fashion, because it's just so specific, but also broad simultaneously. And I think we have talked about it in like intro to visual culture that I'm teaching, and then also history of fashion, a lot of just like the fashion system is so big. And I come back to the Devil Wears Prada speech all the time, and like not for necessarily the same reasons as the speech was given, but like it feels like such a great point of access to fashion, where it's like, she was a nightmare, but like she wasn't wrong. Like
for anyone who's not familiar with the Devil Wears Prada speech, would you care to elaborate a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, what I will do, because I cannot do it justice, but we will link the cerulean dress in the notes here somewhere, because I can't do it justice. But I think the general idea is that this dress does not just exist in this vacuum. This color does not exist in the vacuum. Like it was picked by somebody on years in advance, and no matter where the character got the dress from or what the story was, like she's engaged in the fashion system because of like all of these things that are trickled down from like high fashion, the runway, Pantone, all of these different things that come into these elements. And that side of it is what has made like fashion studies really interesting to me, because it's like there is that social language of fashion, and it exists in this whole system that also touches the entirety of the world.
Do you think there's any way to escape the fashion system? That is a tangential question. We don't have to answer it
Okay. We will answer this now.
Talking about this in the class that I was teaching today, just a little bit. So it's on my brain. But
let's finish that off. We may come back to that on like a larger topic at some point. But I think for most people, no. I think in some situations you can, because obviously there's like even thinking about like the Black Masking Indians, and like kind of that's who I'm writing my thesis about. They're a group in New Orleans that's associated with Mardi Gras. But we were talking before this, before we started recording, about like, these practices that have existed outside of what people have in, very white Western European version of fashion view fashion as. But there are practices where people are kind of just like, they're makers. They are not touching the fashion system. They don't care what the Pantone color of the year is. They're like maybe not even getting their textiles from anywhere that like would be affected by that. They might be using natural dyes. Like in Western culture, probably not. But like in the world, definitely, I want to say. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is my guess. It's funny because when you first asked that, I was like, no, there's no way. I don't believe that. But now I've turned it back around. I do believe it. But you'd have to like make your own textiles. You'd have to be weaving. You'd have to be dyeing. Like you'd have to be on an island, figuratively, literally.
I was about to say,
yeah.
Is that not at least engaging in some mode of fashion production, which still is in the fashion system?
So this will be a bigger thing that we'll circle back to that one because that's big.
So we jumped right into our understanding of fashion cities and the word fashion. But what are some maybe it would do us good, both you and I and the listener, to talk about like previous conceptions of what fashion is?
Yeah, I have none off the top of my head. So we're going to let you start that again as I try to remind myself of some of them off the bat here.
I think we're at like somewhat of a disadvantage to answer this question because we are not a fashion history program, right? So defining fashion is an ongoing project, like an ongoing conversation that we have repeatedly in like every class that we take. And it's usually where I start as like a point of entry for teaching about fashion. But kind of what I was hoping to get at is that like the word capital F fashion we've been taught has historically been like a word that's been defined, or like the standard has been set by like elite Western European society. And in that, from what I can recall from my first semester in this program,
it's been a while.
We looked at scholars like Veblen and Simmel, who talk about things like the constant ever-changing cycle of fashion as a part of being fashion. So kind of a project of modernity, like constantly looking for the next new thing, and it being a part of displaying status and wealth. And those are the two biggest things that I've taken away from what capital F fashion is per Western European standards.
Yeah.
That it is a thing to be modern and a thing to show wealth.
Yeah. And I think the joy of this program in particular is that at Parsons is that they have given us the tools to escape outside of that very specific Western version of it. So like, while we are reading Veblen, we're also like, taking a kind of decolonialist approach there where it's like, okay, well, if we look at the movement and changing the rapidly changing elements of fashion, that doesn't mean that it's not, still fashion, right? And I think that's been the joy of this program, because I think there are so many other places and other schools where they don't necessarily teach fashion that way,
They don't interrogate it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A school that we've talked about that I won't name names. We've talked about it off the record here. That is located somewhere in the city. But they don't necessarily. A lot of other institutions don't have that same approach, and it's really beautiful to come to this school in particular to like view it outside of that lens, because like there are so many things for me as a Black person, as someone from the Caribbean, the ways that we have interacted with fashion over time haven't really changed that much for certain things. Like I think about the costumes of Carnival. I think about, again, the Black masking Indians, right? Like these are forms of dress that have not changed since like 1880 when they came out. Like the textiles have changed, the fabrics, the beads, the feathers, like some of those small things have changed, but it's not the change that like Veblen saw in the leisure class and all of these things, right? So now, because we have a kind of different relationship to it, this is still, for us in this program, viewed as fashion, and I find that really beautiful. It's what drew me to this.
Yeah, there are two quotes from a fashion scholar that come to mind, or from two different fashion scholars that come to mind for me in listening to you talk about how you're understanding fashion. The first one is by Susan Kaiser, and it says, "Fashion is not a thing or an essence. Rather, it's a social and embodied process of negotiation and navigation through the murky and yet hopeful waters of what is to come. Fashion involves becoming collectively with others. Fashion is never finished, and it crosses all kinds of boundaries." And that's kind of where I landed as an undergraduate when I was looking at fashion from an anthropological and archaeological lens, seeing the ways in which it was not a thing, it was like a process. It was like a set of actions, a series of behaviors that people have been engaging in for like as long as I can see, right, into the past. And I take, again, I see things very broadly and I can see the connections through things. And I just not constantly, but when we have these kinds of conversations, I think about people putting clothes on their body for the first time. Is that not fashion? Because I guess the way I think about it is that you do not have fashion without materials that you put on a body. Therefore, materials on a body are fashion.
But I feel that. And I think I have a bad habit of, not necessarily in my writing and in my thinking around fashion, like connecting it to the body a lot of times. Like I'm perpetually thinking about like the meaning of the pieces and like what is implied by wearing it. And that's very important and still kind of what we were talking about right before this as well. And so like generally I always have to keep coming back to this idea that like, okay, well, materials on a body is fashion, but like it needs the body to do that. Because otherwise I just get hung up in like semiotics and like the meaning of pieces, the meaning of clothing. What are you saying by wearing this? And I end up forgetting to actually like interact with like the physical entity.
I will say that that's like one, I'm not going to say disadvantage or weakness, but it's definitely, we have a different focus in this program than most historically inclined programs because they really do look at the fashion object. However, I will say that being so focused on that, then they sometimes forget to see the things that we see. So it's about finding a balance and like knowing when to choose what to focus on.
I mean, I want to go back to that Kaiser definition because to paraphrase Funkmaster Flex, those are bars right there. Like that was just absolute bars. And I think thinking about, the like becoming what fashion can turn you into, like you talked about, the person putting clothing on for the first time. Every time that I put clothing on, especially a new outfit, like that feels like my relationship to clothing again, where like I feel like I'm becoming this version of myself that is like very specific to whatever I'm wearing in that. And I think part of that is my relationship to fashion and how I fell into it or how I fell in love with it really was by going to boarding school, right? And for me, being a like young Black kid at the early teens, trying to navigate a space that was not actively hostile, but not great. And from a position in which like I did not have the means necessarily to like wear what I saw out there, right? And so it was kind of this like double-edged sword for me where like I was able to use fashion as a way to like blend in and not seem like I necessarily, like it was a safety net for me. It was a literal costume. And I was able to like use that to kind of fit into this space. And once I had that like bit of safety that I found in fashion, then it turned for me on its head. And like, then I could figure out, okay, well, like who am I becoming with this? Like, who am I at my core and what am I saying with this? And having that relationship to it, like, I mean, that kind of reflects my work where I'm like, okay, well, like, what are we saying and who am I in this? And I think about just the other day when we saw another on Friday, I was talking about the things that like we pick up as fashion studies people that like an outfit that may not be received to the rest of the world. And so I was wearing like camo pants, combat boots, but then this little Cape Cod sweatshirt that's very silly to me. And I love that combination of things because there's the softness and the traditional like ideals that are associated with Cape Cod of wealth and leisure and all of those things, right? And the other side of like the American military complex and that. And so, that's what I think of every time I put an outfit on. And for the most part, before I got to this program especially, no one was really like seeing fashion in that way similarly. And that was something that, as we talked about on Friday, was like, you pointed that out. And I was like, these are my people that get this now. This is why. And this is like speaking to that system. I think fashion studies allows us to kind of interrogate those things in a very different way than I had available before.
It's so funny that we both thought very intentionally about our outfits on Friday. I was just going to throw in what I was wearing because I have a very complicated relationship with myself. And in that process of becoming, we could get into this in a whole nother episode from like our own personal background with like processes of becoming and like understanding the word fashion, but I'll try to be brief about it. I was wearing a pair of mended jeans under a pink plaid pinafore and then a military jacket on top of that, which is so funny. I just realized we were both wearing military. And for me, that was the mixing and blending of like feminine silhouettes and like softness and like what you might expect from someone who looks like a woman to wear. And then juxtaposing that against like the toughness of denim and the structure of a military wool jacket. And that was me really becoming myself in that moment. And you also noticed, and I just love that about the people here. We're just having like a little love fest in our program right now.
Shouts out to fashion studies folks at Parsons. Shouts out to fashion studies folks in general, but specifically Parsons. If you're, I
like our cohort.
if anyone is interested in fashion studies in the way that we've gotten into it, we'll give a little plug to Parsons there. I will say, I love what we're doing. And I'm very biased, but I do love what we're doing there. But it is interesting to look at what we're doing in relation to like how it's received in the rest of the school, in academia in general, because like fashion... How it's
received by other people, other programs.
Yes. And like in academia...
Even something my undergraduates have experienced coming from Parsons.
Interesting. And I mean, it makes sense to some degree in how people see fashion in general. And there's this like association.
If I can interrupt for a second, I think people think of fashion as a thing or an essence. And inherently by design of this program and the way that, not to the same degree in undergrads, but still they are asking questions that haven't necessarily been asked about the fashion system and how it operates. It is uncomfortable to have someone come into that space and ask, well, why? Who, where, what, when, and why?
And I think that, again, reflects like the frivolity that is usually associated with fashion, right? And that is... I feel that is generally how it's received in other academic spaces, outside of academia in general as well. Like, usually when I'm talking to the academics in other programs here, they view fashion through that lens. And it's like, oh yeah, there's the Parsons people. There's the fashion studies people just doing their fashion thing. And it's like, no, we are sociologists. We are anthropologists. We are folks who are studying politics. But your lens is very broad, or I mean, their lens won't be broad, but our lens is broad in the way that is accessible. And so I think for me personally, I'm like, this is the best way to study people because every single person has some interaction with fashion, right?
Yes.
And I love that.
I'm going to say the micro version of bars.
Go ahead.
Snaps.
Wow, we're going to have to give a direct correlation that the Funkmaster Flex reference translates to snaps for white women. Mental note of that. But yeah, I think it just...
Sorry, that's very funny.
It does feel like that a reflection of that for me, and it's always so challenging when I will meet folks at NSSR, which is the New School for Social Research, and these are folks that are the academics. They come from this long lineage of wonderful academics at the New School, and it's great, and I love that. But like when I talk about their work and then talk about my work, they're like, "Oh my god, it's very similar. Wow, who would have thought?" And it's like, I would have thought. Everyone in this program would have thought. Because like if we view fashion through this lens, like if we view the world through whatever lens, whatever discipline you're coming from, fashion is the most accessible way to view it.
It is. I think though that's one of the interesting things about fashion. We talk about fashion as having ambiguities and ambivalences. Ambiguities meaning not always a clear answer or clear definition. Ambivalences meaning like having opposing feelings, right? You can both feel positive and negative, for example. And fashion is both serious and not serious at the same time. Like one of my like catchphrases is fashion isn't frivolous, but sometimes it also just is. Like fun and fashion is so important. Anyways, I'm getting off topic. There's a tension in fashion. And I think one of the reasons why it took so long for fashion studies to emerge as a discipline in which it is quote unquote pedestrian because it is so accessible. And yet because it is accessible and it touches every part of human life, it then becomes integrated into serious issues.
Yeah.
The fast fashion system is largely responsible for a lot of the environmental and labor issues that we have going on in this world today.
Yeah.
But also fashion is fun to play dress up with, right?
Exactly.
And that's one of the really complicated things that we hold space for in fashion studies.
Yeah. And those 2 points in particular also highlight some of the things that we're going to get into this season as well. And we warned you that it's going to be broad. We're going to be doing a lot here. But grounding us in the fashion system, it'll be great to talk to some folks who are actively doing policy, doing sustainable fashion policy, folks who are approaching it from kind of a more frivolous perspective, because there is joy in that, right?
Absolutely.
There is a lot of fun in just oh, who's wearing what? What's going on at the Met Gala? What's going on the red carpets? There is fun in that. And I think there's a place for fun. And I think fashion allows us to have that place for fun while also having the place for serious academic discourse at the same time. And that's the hope for this season. We're going to give you some serious academic discourse and also just some nonsense simultaneously.
Yeah.
I'm excited.
Me too.
Yeah.
I don't know how this will fit in, but there's a quote from Angela Jansen, which one of our classmates dislikes this article for valid reasons. However, my anthropology feelings were a little bit hurt because it's written by an anthropologist, and I think it's not always necessary, but in this case it was. Part of the anthropological method is to discuss your subject position. So you say, here's who I am and why I'm writing this, so that the reader is not taking this as fact, or that it exists in some kind of vacuum, that you're understanding it through the biases of that person. And that was critiqued by some people, more than one. I particularly remember one person saying anthropologists love to talk about themselves. But that is a part of the anthropological method. But I understand.
And I think it's useful.
I can understand why some people don't like it, but I digress. It's this quote from Angela Jansen, who wrote an article called The Phantasmagoria of Modernity, which says, decolonial fashion discourse proposes a radical redefinition of fashion by delinking it from modernity, the very constitution, and therefore from coloniality, by redefining it as a multitude of possibilities in and outside of modernity, rather than a normative framework falsely claiming universality. And I think that just kind of sums up everything we've been talking about. Multitude of possibilities, rather than normative framework. Which also brings me to the second thing I wanted to say and forgot to say, is that I was going to give a more concrete example of this. In that the kind of traditional fashion exhibit has been either chronological or sometimes thematic fashion history that is centered on Western European states, nations, whatever word you want to use. And privileging the designer. So often elevating fashion to the status of art rather than fashion that exists everywhere.
Everyday fashion.
And so most museums have approached it from that angle. And I am happy to report that there are Parsons alum who are taking this education and this framework and perspective and bringing it into that museum exhibit space, where instead of, seeing a chronology of one type of fashion or a silhouette chronology, instead we're looking at certain themes that can be understood about humans through fashion. The one that's coming to mind is by Lauren Downing-Peters and a colleague whose name I cannot remember, that will be at the Bard Graduate Center in 2025 about American fashion, but specifically how we understand American fashion through evidence of wear, right? So there's a skater's t-shirt that's really torn up and a pair of jeans that have been mended, which I think is illustrating that idea of normative framework, chronological Western European fashion history versus multitude of possibilities. Who are the people and the bodies that wore these clothes and what did they mean? Yeah,
I'm glad you circled back to that. And especially the first part about the kind of anthropological approach, because it's something that I have been talking about with my thesis advisor, Jonathan Square. Shouts out to Jonathan. because I was talking about getting hung up in, not necessarily like identifying myself through this experience, or like as a researcher, or like qualifying my research as a Black person. Because I think initially when I was like taught how to write academically, it was like supposed to be a little bit more distance and disconnect from that. But
I don't believe in that.
No,
That's
not
a research
at all.
method. So even if you are not in your like the thing that you produce as your research, like your writing and your thesis, so much of you they're your words.
Yeah. It's inherently personal.
It is.
And especially for me as a Black person, my worldview is very much shaped from my existence as a Black person. And so like, I feel it necessary to like talk about that and be like, okay, well, I'm looking at what I'm looking at with the Black masking Indians or Zulu or protest or any element of it, because my world is colored by how I was raised and what my existence in this space. And so like, glad you came back to that, because I was like, ooh, that's necessary. I did like that definition, unsurprisingly, because I've like fallen into cultural anthropology over the years. So that's very fitting.
I mean, I have a bias for it, but what can I say?
Yeah. There will be a lot of pro-anthropology biases on this, but while also qualifying the ways in which it's not great. So we've got range here.
It's a beautiful place to end.
Yeah, I love that. Well, tune in as we go on this journey here.
We really can talk.
We can. Yeah, I don't know that this episode was initially intended on being this long. We're just going to give you a little primer, but thank you for a longer...
It was fun.
Thank you for a longer primer.
I would like to leave the listener with a question. What do you think fashion is? And we will leave a Q&A open on Spotify, but also check the episode notes for a link to my project, not to boost myself, but
toot the horn.
I've been working on something called Defining Fashion, which is just a survey, but asks a series of questions to help people think a little bit more closely about what fashion is. And my hope is that it achieves what we are also attempting to do with this podcast, which is to take these conversations outside of the walls of the ivory tower. Yeah. Because I got so annoyed that one semester we're all sitting around debating the word fashion. And I'm like, what does the rest of the world think? Yeah. Because we think about this really deeply.
We do.
What about everyone else?
Yeah. And I think the responses that we've gotten, that you've gotten in particular, and the responses that we will likely get from folks who, are listening in here, still would probably be a little bit skewed.
Oh, definitely.
So I really, those are some of the questions that I really want to, pose to, my dad, who I think of whenever I'm like, what are people not not fully interested in the fashion system thinking? And it's like, I talk to my dad. It's like, that man's out here in golf shirts and sports things and button-ups. So, I should ask him fashion is.
You should have him fill out the survey. Maybe not unfortunately, everyone in my family is very fashionably inclined. So
I said it's a fortunate thing.
Yeah, but now I don't get to ask the questions.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much for listening. This was Fashion Unfolded, and we will see you in the next episode.
Thanks, y'all.